What if everything you thought you knew about the Renaissance was only half the story? What if, behind the marble halls of Florence, the golden palaces of Spain, and the portraits hanging in Europe's grand museums, there was a presence that history tried to erase? Imagine a time when African diplomats walked the same streets as kings, when a black duke ruled one of Italy's most powerful cities, and when the sound of an African trumpet echoed in the court of Henry VIII. How did these men and women shape the most celebrated era in European history, and why have their names been lost for centuries? Stay with me, because what you're about to discover will change the way you see the past forever. During the Renaissance, a time we usually associate with the genius of Leonardo da Vinci, the wealth of the Medici, and the artistic wonders of Michelangelo, a fascinating and often hidden chapter of history was unfolding right alongside it. Many people imagine Europe in this period as a completely white continent, isolated from the African world except for distant trade. But what if I told you that the story is far richer, far more diverse, and far more intriguing than most of us ever learned in school? What if you discovered that Black Africans were not only present in Europe, but played significant, sometimes surprising roles during this era of cultural rebirth? As the Renaissance blossomed from the 14th to the 17th century, Europe was not an isolated fortress. The Mediterranean was a hub of exchange, the Atlantic routes were opening, and the connections with Africa were far deeper than we tend to imagine. Some of these Africans were brought as slaves, yes, but that's not the entire story. Many were sailors, merchants, soldiers, musicians, and even members of royal courts. Some were envoys from African kingdoms, diplomats who walked among kings and popes. And a few, remarkably, rose to positions of power that still puzzle historians today. Take, for example, Alessandro de' Medici, known as the Duke of Florence. Born in 1510, he was widely believed to be the son of Lorenzo de' Medici and a woman of African descent. Imagine that, one of the most powerful families in Europe, patrons of Michelangelo and Botticelli, having a leader with African ancestry at the very heart of Renaissance Italy. Alessandro ruled Florence, minted coins with his image, and shaped the politics of the region before his tragic assassination in 1537. How often do we hear about him in school textbooks? And it wasn't just in Italy. Across the Iberian Peninsula, Black Africans were a familiar presence in cities like Seville, Lisbon, and Granada. After the Reconquista, as Spain and Portugal expanded their influence into Africa and the Atlantic, thousands of Africans came into Europe, some enslaved, others as free people working in ports, workshops, and even palaces. There are records of African musicians in the royal courts of Castile, drummers and trumpeters whose performances echoed through the halls of kings. One of the most remarkable aspects is how they appear in the art of the time. If you look closely at Renaissance paintings, you start to notice figures with African features, not just as exotic curiosities, but sometimes as saints, as noblemen, or as witnesses to great events. The adoration of the Magi, a popular theme for Renaissance painters, often includes one of the three wise men as a Black African king. Why? Because in the European imagination, Africa was not simply a distant, unknown land. It was part of the Christian world, part of a biblical narrative that connected continents. There's also the fascinating story of Saint Maurice, a Roman soldier from Egypt who was venerated as a saint in parts of Germany, Switzerland, and France. In the Renaissance, his image was often portrayed as a Black African knight clad in shining armor. Entire cathedrals had statues and stained-glass windows dedicated to him. Imagine being a peasant or a merchant in 15th century Europe, walking into a church and seeing a Black saint holding a spear and shield, a symbol of courage and faith. Of course, not every African in Europe was free or honored. The slave trade was expanding, particularly in Portugal and Spain, and thousands were forced into labor. In Venice and Genoa, African slaves were sold in markets. In Lisbon, they made up a significant percentage of the city's population. But here's something surprising. Many of these enslaved individuals gained their freedom after a certain period, and some became integrated into local society. Marriage between Africans and Europeans was not unheard of, and the lines of race were often drawn differently, than the strict categories we think of today. One amazing fact is that African presence influenced even the great explorers and thinkers of the Renaissance. For example, the Portuguese voyages down the African coast in the 15th century were guided by African navigators and interpreters who had deep knowledge of the seas and trade routes. Some Africans served aboard ships that crossed the Atlantic, not only as captives, but as crew members who shaped the age of discovery. And what about England? Many people think of Shakespeare's time as a purely English, white world, but records show Black Africans living in Tudor England, working in households, performing music, and even appearing at court. One famous example is the presence of a Black trumpeter named John Blank, who performed for both Henry VII and Henry VIII. He was so valued that he petitioned the king for a pay raise and got it. Imagine the sound of his trumpet echoing through the halls of the English court, a testament to a hidden diversity we rarely picture. When we think of the Renaissance, we think of great intellectual exchange, of ideas traveling from one culture to another. But we often forget how much of this exchange was embodied by people themselves. African scholars and diplomats visited Europe to negotiate alliances, share knowledge, and represent their kingdoms. Ambassadors from the Kingdom of Congo met with the Pope in Rome. Ethiopian envoys were received with honor and curiosity. These encounters were moments of genuine cultural dialogue, long before the modern concept of globalization. What's even more intriguing is how these Black Africans were sometimes seen not as outsiders, but as symbols of mystery, wisdom, or even holiness. In art and literature, they could embody the exotic and the divine, the earthly and the otherworldly. They became part of a Renaissance fascination with the wider world, a world that was bigger, more colorful, and more interconnected than the maps suggested. Yet, as centuries passed, many of these stories were erased, downplayed, or simply forgotten. The rise of the Atlantic slave trade, the brutal racial ideologies of later centuries, and the rewriting of history during colonial times created a false image that Europe was always white, that Africans only arrived as slaves, that they had no role in shaping its culture. But the evidence is there, in the paintings, the archives, the coins, the church records, showing a more complex and fascinating reality. Imagine walking the streets of 16th century Lisbon and hearing a mix of Portuguese, Wolof, Kikongo, and Arabic spoken in the same market. Imagine a Venetian noblewoman being served by a Black maid who came from North Africa. Imagine a German cathedral where a Black saint gazes down from a stained glass window. These are not fantasies, they were part of daily life for some Europeans during the Renaissance. And here's another incredible fact. Some African-descended individuals left a mark that outlasted their lifetimes. In Seville, for example, the Brotherhood of the Black Africans was a religious and social organization where Africans, both enslaved and free, gathered to support one another, celebrate festivals, and worship. Their processions and music became part of the city's culture. In Florence, Alessandro de' Medici's descendants continued to shape politics long after his death. Even the world of fashion, music, and literature absorbed African influences in subtle ways. African drummers introduced rhythms that fascinated European ears. Ivory, gold, and textiles from African trade routes became symbols of status. Writers mentioned Black characters not always as slaves, but as travelers, warriors, or even lovers. Why is this history so captivating today? Because it challenges the simplistic narratives we've been told. It reminds us that history is rarely black and white. It is full of crossings, encounters, and shared stories. And it shows that the presence of Black Africans in Europe was not an anomaly, but a thread woven into the very fabric of Renaissance life. Think about this the next time you look at a Renaissance painting or read about the Age of Discovery. Who were the people in the background, the ones not always named in the textbooks? Who played the music at the banquets? Who translated the foreign words? Who advised the kings? Their faces were there, their voices were there, their footprints remain if we choose to see them. And perhaps the most amazing fact of all is that this hidden history is still being uncovered. Every year, historians and researchers find new evidence, a forgotten letter, a baptism record, a portrait with a dark-skinned figure overlooked for centuries. Piece by piece, the puzzle comes together, revealing a Europe that was more diverse, more connected, and more human than we imagined. So now that you know this, here's the question. How many more secrets are hiding in plain sight, waiting to rewrite what we think we know about the past? If this story made you see the Renaissance in a whole new light, imagine what else is out there. Share this with someone who loves history. Start a conversation. Challenge the version of the past we've been told. Because history doesn't belong in dusty books. It belongs in our voices, in our questions, and in our willingness to look closer. The Renaissance was more than a rebirth of art and science. It was a crossroads of worlds, and the next chapter is still waiting to be told.